there are two modes of communication, generally speaking. There's debate and there's dialogue. And in debate mode, we're constantly looking for the holes in people's arguments so we can dive in and say, aha, that's your problem. And then you tear it apart, right? That doesn't work so well in negotiations. You have to be in dialogue mode. You have to be in a mode where you're listening for what it is that they're really trying to achieve, because if they don't get what they want, you don't get what you want.
How would you define negotiation?
You're really negotiating anytime you have an issue or a challenge where you're trying to persuade the other or influence the other to do what it is that you would like. And that can be around, an agreement or trying to work out a business deal, for example. But it can also be if you and your child are disagreeing about something, you got to explain why it is that they can't go out at night because you're worried about their safety and security, something along those lines. So it's any time really that you engage in a conversation with somebody and there's an element of influence, persuasion, and trying to help and trying to meet your goals. I mean, that's the other piece of this, is that when you go into negotiation, you have an objective. And your objective is not necessarily to reach agreement. It's actually to achieve whatever goal you set forth. And so I would add that to the definition, is that it's a process where you're trying to achieve your goal really through persuasion, influence, etc.
So tell us a little bit about the situations that we find ourselves in where we are actually negotiators.
Sure. Well, actually, the reality is we negotiate every day, all the time. I really, really believe that, and I see it. So I kind of know it's true. So part of the challenge is to realize that negotiation is not just about contracts and salary. Those are obviously negotiations, but we engage in negotiation every day when we're dealing with our boss and we're trying to persuade them. You're negotiating. When you're working on a team project and you've got somebody who doesn't agree with you on a way in which you might want to take the project, you're negotiating. If you're overseeing people at work, for example, you can coerce them, but most people don't do things very well when they're coerced. If I create a vision and I get you to kind of engage with me in a process, some people might call that leadership. I would call it leadership and negotiation. Beyond that, for those of us who have a partner or a spouse, we do that every day when we're trying to figure out how do we manage our schedules, how do we figure out where we're going on vacation, all of those things. When people have differences of opinion and you start to engage and walk them through.
Yeah, it's nonstop when you look at it that way.
Yeah, and then even in the world around you, if you're dealing with credit card companies or whomever, when you're going to buy a car or you're buying a house or any of those things, they're all negotiations, and we really do them every day. And so the biggest challenge I find is most people try to intuit their way through it, is the way that I say it. They think that they can just figure out their way through a negotiation without really giving it a lot of thought and without really planning. And in fact, one of the key elements of any negotiation, whether it's with your kid or your boss or a client, or if you're a salesperson, is planning and preparation. And so one of the biggest mistakes that folks make is just thinking they can, sort of fiddle their way through it and they'll come out at the end with what they want. And it really requires, for me, if I were to break down a negotiation process into components, sort of preparation, the actual engagement of negotiation, and then the implementation, I would say I probably spend 60 to 65% in the planning process of thinking through, what do I want? How am I going to try to achieve that? What happens if it doesn't go the way I want it to go? Where do I take things then?
Yeah, I never considered, when I, again, think about the television version of negotiation, I always think about them in the heat of the moment. But it's so interesting that a big part of it happens way before the interaction takes place.
Right. And in fact, most of your negotiations are ones where you have time to plan. And even, when there is a negotiation that sort of pops up in the moment, I often tell people you shouldn't hesitate to step away and try to think a little bit. Even 5 or 10 minutes gives you enough time to sort of get your thoughts together. Some of the biggest mistakes that we make in negotiation are in the moment, when we're not sure, when we maybe are getting pressured. And so much better to actually say, you know what, I think I need to, pull back here for a minute and go get a cup of coffee and think about what's going on. And let me come back to you with some thoughts. I find even when you have the ability to just get yourself out of the moment, we call that, my colleague at Harvard, great guy named William Ury, calls like going to the balcony. And
Hmm.
going to the balcony is just a place to metaphorically step back to so that you don't do something that you would regret.
What are some common myths about negotiation that you encounter?
Yeah, there's a lot, unfortunately. I think the biggest myths are, the first one is that it's a win-lose process, that someone's going to get something and someone's going to lose out. And I think that a lot of people go into negotiation with that mindset, and your mindset matters a lot when you negotiate. Because the old adage, if everything looks like a nail, you use a hammer.
Hmm.
And so if you change the way you're thinking, and you kind of see the other negotiator as a problem-solving partner, which frankly is really what they are, then you change the game and you change what you're doing. So I think that that's myth one. Another myth that's really important is that compromise is sort of synonymous with negotiation, that I have to, in order to reach some agreement, I have to give something up that I really care about. Well, that's true to a degree in some negotiations. It's not true in a lot of negotiations, where actually creativity is far more important. So information is the currency of negotiation. And so if you gather more and more information, um, that's going to help you to actually find value. And in negotiation, we don't necessarily mean money when we talk about value. We mean what it is that matters to people. And there's lots of things that matter to people. And so if I'm being creative and if I'm focused on creatively trying to figure out, can we make this work? And if so, how? And part of that is, what is it that what do I really want in this situation? And what does the other person really want? And when you're compromising quickly, which is what a lot of people do in negotiation, especially when things get stuck, they don't ever explore what it is that's really important. And I'll give you a quick example. So when you're negotiating around a salary, for example, people ask me that all the time. How do I do that? And the answer is actually that it may surprise people a little bit, which is that I say, don't think about the money. Money will be there and you're going to discuss the money. But think about, what are all the other things that matter to you in this situation? So is there flex time? And you telecommute? Is there, what kind of benefits do they have? Things along those lines. And because those things have a tremendous amount of value to a lot of people. And that's actually how you build out something that can work better for you. And that's not about compromise. That's about understanding what we would call the underlying interests that people have in negotiation and constructing an agreement based on those, as opposed to sort of the superficial things that people often discuss and never really get down to understand, what's really going on there. And I think that the third mistake that I see is that people don't understand the role of psychology in negotiation. Psychology is critically important. When you're negotiating with somebody, you're negotiating with a human being that's across the table from you. And if you somehow disrespect them, if you present a challenge to their identity or cause them to be embarrassed or lose face, all of those things are going to destroy a potential agreement. And so you've got to be in tune to the fact that those intangibles, those things that make us human, are part of the process, and you have to pay attention to them. I was actually just talking to a colleague the other day about a negotiation that he was involved in, and he took the parties, he was actually mediating, and he took the parties to that psychological realm. And it turned out that what the real block was disrespect. It had nothing to do with the dollars and cents that they were arguing over. It actually had to do with the fact that one of the parties really felt disrespected by the other. And that happens a lot more than people really think. And much of the time, people aren't even considering the psychological realm when they're negotiating.
What are some ways that we can get to the bottom of what the psychological issues that are going on that can help us solve a stuck negotiation?
Right. So, two of the real keys, and it's not rocket science, it's actually quite simple, is really listening and asking questions. So most people think that the best negotiators are the smoothest talkers. But the reality is that the best negotiators, if you remember, if you buy into the notion that information is the currency of negotiation, you don't get it by talking. You get it by asking a question and listening very carefully to what it is that the other person is saying. So the first piece of this is really sort of thinking, what are the kind of questions that are going to elicit information. So open-ended questions like, could you tell me why that's so important to you? Or can you share a little bit about a concern that you might have? I'm sensing that there's an issue or a concern, or maybe we're dancing around the topic. Feel free to tell me if we are. So part of it is, some of those questions that get you into more of a dialogue. One of the challenges is that there are two modes of communication, generally speaking. There's debate and there's dialogue. And in debate mode, we're constantly looking for the holes in people's arguments so we can dive in and say, aha, that's your problem, and then you tear it apart, right? That doesn't work so well in negotiations. You have to be in dialogue mode. You have to be in a mode where you're listening for what it is that they're really trying to achieve, because if they don't get what they want, you don't get what you want. People don't understand the interdependent nature of negotiation. And I've had people say to me, well, that's your problem. When you figure it out, let me know. And I say, actually, it's not. It's actually both of our problems, because if I don't figure this out, you're not going to figure out what you want. So it's questions, but it's also listening. And people, I often do a lot of trainings, and I'll say to people, how many of you think you're a good listener? And everybody's hand goes up, of course. But the reality is that most people aren't. And one of the real blocks to listening well is the voice in our head. So when you're having a conversation and somebody says something, or when you're negotiating and somebody says something that you don't agree with, etc., you start to think in your mind, how can they think that, etc. And so you're having that internal conversation. And when you do that, you're now not listening anymore. But you've missed everything else that they've been telling us. So you have to pause. You have to really focus in on what are they saying. I often write things down so that I've forced myself to really make sure that I'm listening carefully to what they're telling me and putting things down. And if I do feel like there's something they've said that I would like to kind of discuss more, because maybe it's not so accurate from my point of view or needs to get addressed, I'll put a little star next to it so I know to get back to it. But it's really that combination, because listening and those questions get us down to those underlying interests and the things that are really motivating people in negotiation.
So we've talked about the importance of preparation and then of being a good listener and understanding the motivations, especially the intangible ones. What's the next step?
So the next step, once you've understood that, you're very far down the road of coming to some agreement or moving forward in the way that you would like. But the next step is actually not to just go with the first idea that comes to mind. It's actually to try to engage in a bit of a creative process to figure out what is the best solution that would meet those interests that you've identified. And that usually takes the form of some kind of brainstorming or something like that. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that brainstorming or spitballing, whatever you want to call it, is a bit of a tired concept. The problem is that it actually works because it frees people's minds from their constraints. It enables you to think about what's possible. And when you start to think about what's possible, lots of things emerge. And the key to this creative process is coming up with sort of creative, wild ideas, not the you could do it, I could do it, or we split the difference. But like, what could we really do? Like, if you could think of the absolute best case for you, what would it look like? And you take someone there and you say, well, I may not be able to do all of that, but if we added these things to that, then that becomes more doable. And so it becomes a process of a back and forth. So it's really important that people have a hand in creating the solution. There's all kinds of research that suggests that if people actually are part of the process of solving a problem, they're much more likely to actually implement it. So process matters a lot in negotiation. It's not just the outcome, but it's how you get there that is really important.
And you talk about using a Batna. Can you explain what that term is?
I can, and Batna is a really, really important concept when it comes to negotiation. So your BATNA stands for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what that simply means, is, as basic as I could put it, is it answers the question, what will happen if I can't reach agreement in this situation? Like, what am I walking away to? So if I'm at one car dealer and I'm on a car dealer mile that exists all around the country, right? If I'm at one place, I can go to the next place and see, is there a comparable car that perhaps I can get for less? So your BATN is really about what's your alternative if I can't reach agreement here. And it's really important for comparison purposes, and to know whether you should take a deal. Because if you have a good Batna, if there are a bunch of alternatives that are out there, then you don't need to reach an agreement in your current negotiation. You have perfectly viable alternatives elsewhere. And that should give you a lot of confidence. So when
So
you're going,
it helps you to not be overly invested if you know you have an alternative. Is that correct?
that's exactly right.
It seems like there almost always is an alternative when we think there isn't, if there's enough creativity and brainstorming.
And it's exactly it. You have to always realize that you have a BATNA. It may not be great, but then if you invest time, just like you might around creative options, if you invest some time saying, well, is there a way that we could actually make this, our BATNA better? You often find ways to do that. And sometimes it's building coalitions. Sometimes it's, things along those lines that can really help you.
Well, you talk about us being assertive without being aggressive. Could you tease out, because those words seem almost synonymous, what you mean?
Yeah, assertiveness is critical in negotiation. I mean, you have to be able to assert for what you need, and a lot of people struggle to do that effectively. The best way that I've heard it described, and the way that I share this, is basically when you're asserting for yourself, you're standing on your own 2 feet. When you're aggressive, you're standing on someone else's toes. In other words, you're feeling the need to beat the other person up verbally or whatever in order to get where you want to go. When you're assertive, you don't do that. You just say, this is what I need to have in order for this negotiation to work for me.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Dr. Weiss.
You are most welcome. It was great. Thank you.
And I want to ask you now about a situation that we all find ourselves dreading, I think, and that is when we need to make a big purchase like a car or a house. And we get that anxiety in our stomach and we just don't know if we're going to be taken advantage of. Walk us through some concrete ways that we can make our next big purchase and feel confident about it.
So the first thing is back to planning. So one of the great things about the internet is that we now have so much information that we didn't have 20 years ago. So if I'm going to go buy a car or a house, I can look at comparables. I can find out what the car costs. So you've got to do your homework. That's really, really important. And when you do your homework, what you'll find is that if you were to actually go and meet with a dealer, you have a much better sense of what things cost and what you're willing to pay. And so when they come back and they say, here's the price of the car, and it doesn't fit with what you've found, then that gives you the ability to say, I've done some homework here and some research, and here's what I found to be the industry standard. So can you explain to me why it is that your price is $5,000 above that industry standard? What's different about this car, etc.?
Another common situation that I think people find themselves in that's very awkward around negotiations is the salary negotiation. What are some very practical tips that someone who's getting ready to go in for their annual review this year can employ to make that a positive, successful experience?
Sure. Well, the first thing to do is ask yourself, why is this so awkward? Why do you feel like it's so uncomfortable? And for some people, it's the money. They don't like to talk about money. They think they're going to be viewed as greedy. But the reality is that we all need to make a living. And if we're doing a good job, it's perfectly reasonable to ask for that. But we're back to preparation, and we're back to also looking around your environment and saying, am I being paid fairly? Again, it's partly psychological, right? That a lot of times when people are asking for a raise, it's because the people that work with them and do the same job as them are making more than them, which isn't fair, right? So there are principles that often make their way in that are valuable to pick up on. So for example, if that's the case where you're doing the same work as other people, but you're being paid less, well, you can talk about the principle of equality, and that's a way to start the conversation. But I would just ask people to reflect and really think, why is it that you feel so uncomfortable in that kind of a conversation, especially if you've gotten great evaluations, you're doing a good job. You should ask for that. Again, you're back to being assertive and recognizing your value and your worth.